I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we begin a series of episodes on the abduction, kidnapping, capture, call it what you will, of Venezuelan President Maduro by the United States of America. On this edition of the show, we'll be hearing from friend of the program, Nolan Higdon, a critical media literacy scholar who runs the Gaslight Gazette Substack. And we're going to be talking about the basics when it comes to the story that is unfolding and how to understand it without speculating too much. This is a short but sweet episode, and we'll also delve into how the media has been covering this story. Nolan has some criticisms of that. In any case, Nolan Higdon and I will break it all down for you. This is the first in a series of episodes on the subject of Venezuela that is really in the headlines right now. And I'm still shocked. I mean, there were hints that something was coming, but still, when it hits, it hits. In any case, before we get to the conversation, I want to remind you that it is you, the listener, that makes this show possible. So if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. $10 and above tier supporters get a producer's credit shout out at the end of each and every episode. I will hopefully be updating the producer's credits this month. If your name hasn't popped up, shoot me a line, a DM on Twitter, or email me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com, and I'll fix that. Sometimes I haven't gotten updates in my email about new subscribers, and I'm working at a breakneck pace to get all this Venezuela stuff out there. I've recorded a few episodes, so bear with me on that, and please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. Of course, you get the monthly Parallax vlog with myself and C. Derek Varn if you subscribe. And also, you can even just support the show at $1, a measly $1. Show your support. And also, if you can, check out the website of my one and only sponsor, Mike Swanson of Wall Street Window. Check out wallstreetwindow.com for the best trading and financial news. I've had listeners make return on investment from Mike's trading tips. And if you sign up to his newsletter, you can also get his free ebook, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I've ever used. Really useful and powerful information if you're involved in any way with the stock market. So once again, wallstreetwindow.com. Thanks again, Mike Swanson, for sponsoring the show. And with that being said, let's get right to it with Nolan Higdon. Welcome back to Parallax Views. Nolan Higdon, who's been on the show multiple times before. He's collaborated with Project Censored, hosts the Disinfo Detox podcast, and runs a newsletter, I guess, the Gaslight Gazette, which I don't think the last time I had you on, you hadn't started that yet. So maybe you can tell us about that. But first, how are you doing, Nolan Higdon?
I'm doing well, and it's a pleasure to be back chatting with you. I've been following what you're doing, and it's always interesting. I'm trying to keep up with how much work you're doing as well. So thanks for having me back.
So tell my listeners, introduce them to the Gaslight Gazette.
Yeah, it kind of came from an interesting place. I was, doing a lot of freelance publishing of op-eds on media, politics, and technology. And, people would ask me, where can I find this article or that article? So I wanted kind of one place to house them. And so I opened up a Substack, and it really took off with popularity, and subsequently launched a podcast. So now people can subscribe, and I put out a handful of articles, mostly free each month, looking at fake news, censorship, the intersection of technology and democracy, particularly around AI, and just a lot of original work to kind of keep people up to date. I think it's really targeted toward folks who maybe don't have time to follow like in depth of these news stories, and I try and kind of pull back the curtain. So you can get it at nolanhigdon.substack.com, and I highly encourage people to subscribe.
And let's get to the big event that has happened in the past few days. Venezuela. I do not know how to parse through this because it just seems like I mean, I feel like I've been living in a fever dream. It's like one second I'm thinking, oh, the this is like a regime change. Then the next, it's like, well, Maduro's vice president is in power now. And then Trump is saying, well, no, actually, I am in charge of Venezuela now. I don't know what's going on. All I know is Maduro's been kidnapped.
Yeah, I think, one thing I think to kind of frame what you're saying there that helps make it make sense is I think a lot of folks remember the first Trump administration as one that had like these really big promises and then like almost these like buffoonish failures, right? They were unable to follow through on like these things like the wall, for example. He couldn't even get it passed through Congress. He really changed that with his second term. Trump and this administration really came in prepared for a handful of objectives, and I think they've been, successful at achieving them. Of course, he's Trump, so he always like overpromises and underdelivers. Like he didn't deport 12 million undocumented immigrants he promised, but still, impressive amount. Hundreds of thousands of folks have been rounded up, largely without due process and removed. But I think Venezuela's no different in that sense. On day one, he signed an executive order to effectively make Venezuela what he called a narco-terrorism state. And in there, his administration was already laying the justifications for what they thought was a U.S. invasion of Venezuela and possibly overthrow of that government. And then his administration has worked, both in terms of communication and on the ground with like these boat strikes to try and convince the public that it's in their interest for us to get further involved in Venezuela. And he seemed to think that here in early January 2026 was the right time to pull the trigger on this larger agenda. And I think the last thing I'll say on that too is that the larger agenda is not just Venezuela, although Venezuela is a major part of that. Trump really wants to, establish or reestablish the United States as an imperial power and by expanding its borders and directly going into conflict with its adversaries. And that means, trying to get Greenland, Mexico, Canada, and or even Colombia, apparently. And Venezuela seems to be a part of that agenda. And I think lost in a lot of media narratives, everyone keeps saying it's about oil. That's kind of an oversimplification, which we can get into. But one part of where oil does play a critical role here is with China. China buys 80% of Venezuelan oil. And so this is also a way to hurt what Trump sees a U.S. adversary in China. So I kind of think that's kind of the broad, like macro view. And then, of course, we can get into the propaganda and contradictions used to justify it.
Well, yeah, let's talk about the oil angle because I believe Chevron um, has sort of said some things like, well, we're already, in the region. They were in the region during Biden. I think you bring this up in your article on it. It just doesn't seem like necessarily like the oil lobby was even like big on this idea.
No, and this is where history becomes really important. So, the U.S. companies have operated in Venezuela for decades. The relationship really hit a rough point in 2007 when the leftist revolution took over there, by most famously by Hugo Chavez. And they wanted to force the American companies to be a part of a national oil industry in Venezuela. So basically, the people and the government could extract wealth from this resource. And this was all done constitutionally within the Venezuelan government legally. These companies had an opportunity to either, play ball or leave. Some, like Chevron, played ball. They stuck around. Others, like ExxonMobil and Conoco, decided to leave. And so that's domestic law within Venezuela. Now, international law, and there's a lot to say about that, but international law uh, courts heard out ExxonMobil, and ExxonMobil was not saying it owned the oil. So when Trump says they stole our oil, that's just simply factually inaccurate. What what Exxon and other companies were arguing in the courts was, hey, we put a lot of resources in to extract that oil. We had some rights to that land that were taken away. And so they went to court over that, asking for excess of $1 billion. Exxon's won some court cases. It's been overthrown in favor of Venezuela and others. At one point, Venezuela offered to pay $255 million. So that was kind of going back and forth in the courts over the last 20 years, even up till quite recently. And so the reduction in oil production from those companies was a choice they made by leaving Venezuela. And then add on top of that, the United States started sanctioning Venezuela 2014, 2015. That further hindered oil coming out of Venezuela as well. And so when they say that Venezuela mismanaged the oil industry, that's highly misleading, because it ignores the sanctions portion of it and how these other companies, decide to pull out and not play ball with the government. And to your point, before this invasion, Trump had reached out to these oil companies to say, hey, if we open up Venezuela, would you guys want to go back in? And it was a unanimous no. Chevron was already there operating because they had gotten a pass to do so under the Biden administration. But these other companies were like, no, because the technology is now so outdated. We've been gone so long. And if we update it, we don't know what government's going to be in place. Is a new government going to come in and take it right away? What's going to happen? So there was no interest. And then after the invasion, Trump asked again and said, like, hey, if you guys want to access the oil, you have to rebuild the infrastructure. And they again said, no, for the same reason. We don't know who's in charge. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't even know how much money it's going to cost. Some estimate it's going to be upwards of like 58 billion to update some of these oil fields. So the oil is I mean it's a part, as I mentioned, with China. It's part of like a larger kind of like international narrative, but I think it's largely been kind of a distraction to the larger goals here of the Trump administration.
Now let's get into the big one, and I've heard it here in Florida from people. Well, he's killing us all with bringing the fentanyl in, Maduro, the gangster narco terrorist, and I'm like, I do not understand this narrative, and I think it's like something out of an '80s action movie.
Yeah, I think you're right to look to the
It's a
past.
Chuck Norris movie, man.
It is. And I think you're right to look to the past. Trump, has this, I don't know, this habit of kind of leaning on things that have worked in like conservative lore of the past. And I think the war on drugs is like one of those. I don't mean to diminish the actual fentanyl crisis, which is happening across the nation in a lot of places. And I think Trump is trying to kind of marry those two. But, I think the fact that JD Vance has recently been on television and social media trying to argue against all the data that say that Venezuela, has minimal impact on the drugs in the United States, I think that indicates they know that's kind of a non-winner. They may be trying to cling to it for like a certain segment of their base, but I don't think that one's resonating with the population, nor is the idea that drugs is tantamount to terrorism, which is another claim they've tried to make off that as well.
And then, of course, you have the really interesting development where the major opposition leader to Maduro, Machado, uh, has basically been thrown under the bus by Trump after winning the Nobel Prize and basically like thanking Trump. Trump is like, you are not actually respected enough. So no, you're not going to be the one in power in Venezuela. What do you make of this?
Well, I think, for context, one of the things that has to be said here is, and I know this looks like I'm going somewhere else, but U.S. media, U.S. news media is really controlled by a handful of corporations, and the way they've maximized their profits over the last 30 or so years is to cut a lot of reporting, and that is includes reporting abroad. And so we don't have a lot of journalists on the ground who are really like embedded in Venezuela day in and day out. The ones who are there, are probably freelancers who are doing what they can to not anger, the leadership in Venezuela while getting news out, or it's U.S. journalists who just dropped in after the overthrow, and now they're on the ground and they talk to three people and they think they're experts. And I say that because, in doing some research, there's a lot of U.S. reporting that Machado, the opposition leader, is very popular, and that when Trump said he doesn't think there's anybody in the country who has support now that Maduro's gone, so the U.S. is going to stay, a lot of people pointed to Machado, noting that reporting. There's also other reporting that, like, some polls have found her having a 90% unfavorable rating. And then of course there's the electoral outcomes, which showed her popularity. And so I kind of say that the US, it's really difficult to tell what the reality is on the ground from the data we have. But I think the US news media is kind of tying itself in knots because it's given some conflicting viewpoints on this. It's at the one time said she's popular, while there's some like opposition reporting on that. She seemed to align herself with Trump, which seemed to indicate she was going to lead the opposition. And now Trump says no. So I think there's a lot of confusion in what the truth is there with that.
Um, in terms of where this could go next, I mean, what are your big concerns? And where do you think journalists should be really what should they be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, good question. I think in we could talk about this at kind of two levels. I think in Venezuela, we have to determine whether or not the U.S. is going to occupy Venezuela like it did, say, post 2003 invasion in Iraq. And Trump initially indicated that. Rubio contradicted him the next day. Then the next day, Trump contradicted Rubio. And so, depending on that decision, I think that's going to be massive for the United States, not just in terms of having people on the ground and what's going to happen to the people of Venezuela. As we've seen, there's reactions to that. It breeds more anger and resentment against the United States, which U.S. people are going to feel around the world. And it can also destabilize the region, right? If there's all these different kind of factions fighting for power, and some are for, some are against, some are indifferent to the United States, that's going to bleed over into neighboring countries like Brazil and others. And so I think that's one thing to watch down there. Now, domestically, I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, Trump's rhetoric about taking Greenland. I think some folks thought it was a joke, but about 2 weeks ago, he launched an envoy to go up there to seriously investigate this. He's now openly talking about how Cuba and Colombia, their leadership may need to be overthrown because they're supposedly failing in his estimation. I don't really see Canada and Mexico being invaded anytime soon by the United States, but who knows? Those are things, though, as journalists, I would watch. I think the era of when people kind of laugh off and say, "Oh, that's just Trump being Trump," I think that's over, especially with foreign policy.
What do you think the end game is? I mean, are we in a new sort of paradigm with Trump? I mean, a lot of people are talking about this is the agenda of like Trump wanting hemispheric dominance, the sphere of influence. I mean, is that what is happening or
It does seem to indicate that way, and I don't want to be an alarmist, but I'll admit that in a lot of conversations, I've sort of talked about a lot of kind of the pre-World War II feelings that I seem to get when looking at the globe, whether it be Russia and Ukraine, Israeli expansion, China and Taiwan, the United States expanding. It does seem like a lot of powers around the globe are really trying to assert their dominance where they can, and that generally means nobody recognizes one single power when all these countries feel comfortable doing this. And unfortunately, as humans have found out in the past, that generally leads to a lot of death and a lot of fighting over land and resources.
and I know you've written about it seems like there's trouble in paradise in the world of the right wing with America First types like Thomas Massey, or I don't know if Massey considers himself part of that, but anyways, Marjorie Taylor Greene is another one. They're kind of upset about this Venezuela stuff, and you asked the question in your article: does this policy align with America First principles? So let's talk about that.
Yeah, and this came up again over the weekend after that article came out. Representative Jim Jordan was on CNN, and Dana Bash, I guess, decided this was the one time a year to ask a tough question, and really pushed him on the America First agenda. And yeah, basically, there's a feeling amongst the folks who are alive and young in say 2003 or around that time that the Iraq War was a ginormous mistake. And whether you're a liberal, centrist, or conservative, all have different reasons for why that was a mistake. And it really, I think, got a lot of people really attuned to politics. And so that was kind of an awakening for a lot of people. And that includes people in the conservative movement who liked a lot of the conservative message, but saw this, nation building and occupation and regime change as being antithetical to conservative principles, whether it be, spending money or avoiding big government, whatever it may be. And it really coalesced around this concept of America first. Why are we spending money? Why are we engaged in military action for other countries? It should all be here at home. And Trump ran with that message in 2016. I mean, he really went after that America first kind of narrative, and it was he was on a debate stage when he said that the Iraq War was a mistake. He was on a Republican primary debate stage, and you could hear like gasps in the audience because they're like, "What? A political figure will admit this?" And there was also a lot of like thunderous applause from like America First type people. And so that was kind of the coalition he built to change the Republican Party. And this is the interesting thing about, Trump. We're in this kind of transition period with the parties. Trump is able to get people who prioritize America first in the coalition, even if maybe they're pro-choice, or whatever it may be. He can get them in the coalition on that. And you saw this start to fracture during the 2024 campaign. There was a debate about whether or not we should bring uh, immigrants to this country on work visas. And there's a big divide within the MAGA movement about, allowing immigrants to come in, theoretically gives jobs to immigrants. That's not America first. And Trump tried to like quell that by getting rid of like Vivek Ramaswamy and just like silencing it. But Venezuela has brought all of that back up again. And some of the folks in the MAGA coalition are of that old kind of neoconservative view, the George W. Bush view that the United States is the world's power. It should assert its dominance. Whatever it does is justified. It should go around the world and force people to its will, capitalism being number one. And Marco Rubio is one of those. And Rubio was a latecomer to the coalition. I mean, he'd been, insulted by Trump, calling him Little Marco. And Rubio joined the coalition. And Susie Wiles had an interesting interview in Vanity Fair last month where she talked about how um, Rubio wrestled with this question. How could America first fit with like the neoconservative view? And Rubio's background is that he believed his family came from Cuba, fleeing the leftist revolution there. And he represented in Florida a lot of Cuban exiles and a lot of Venezuelan exiles, about 300,000 who were also fleeing the leftist regime in Venezuela. So he has a really hardened conservative worldview about fighting these kind of leftist Latin American regimes. And he coupled that with the kind of neoconservative view. But you have to, again, how does it serve Americans is what's missing from that. And Rubio seems to think, a better economy, in particular with oil, getting rid of drugs, combating terrorism. That was like the message he thought was going to sell this as America first. But immediately it's falling apart. I mean, it was already falling apart with U.S. support for Israel, but this really took it off the rails. And you're starting to see that divide. And that's why, I don't want to get liberals too excited here, but, if there is a discussion of impeachment or, something like that, Democrats do not need too many Republicans to open that up. And some of these Republicans who are nervous about losing their seats or already on their way out and maybe just want to give a middle finger to the president they think ruined their party, there could be some leverage there at some point. And I think that's also why you see people like Rubio trying to kind of roll back the we're going to occupy them language and make it much more like a narrow legal justification for what happened.
One thing that we haven't touched on is what could this captured I keep using the word kidnapping myself personally because that's what I think it should be called. This kidnapping of Maduro. I mean, what does this mean for like the U.S. Constitution and just rule of law?
Well, in the U.S. Constitution, this gets back to the media problem here. The media has not talked about this for what it is, which is, an act of war, or you can call it a coup, or you can call it an overthrow. But they don't use that language here, and I think that's really problematic because anywhere else we would use this language, right? This is like they have no problem saying Putin's doing an act of war, and like that's no problem. But they don't call it that, and so I think in a lot of Americans' minds, this is like somehow unsettled, like opaque legal ease. And it's like, no, it's pretty clear. Congress has the right to declare war. Sometimes if the president is in an emergency state where something has to be done quickly, he can and then go to Congress shortly thereafter. But there's a lot of Congress people, Senator Murphy in particular, who say that Hegseth and Rubio knew about this invasion and directly lied to Congress. Afterward, Rubio said, "Well, we didn't have time; we had to go." And now it seems like they did know. So that's a clear violation of the Constitution. But again, you need Congress to hold them accountable. And I mean, they just blew past the Epstein deadline, and Congress hasn't held them accountable for that either. Internationally speaking, there's been a litany of countries that have come out and said this is a clear violation of international law. And I think this is going to. I don't anticipate that Trump or the Trump administration will be held accountable under international law because Americans usually aren't, a la Donald Rumsfeld. But I think this is going to further erode people's faith in any of these international institutions because when there's something so brazen, you can't hold people accountable, even if it was like a fine or a slap on the wrist. I think it's going to further erode that confidence, as we've seen, like I said, with Rumsfeld here in the U.S., or even U.S. allies like Benjamin Netanyahu, who's been indicted but not been put on trial. Meanwhile, You can have like these smaller countries' leaders were easily picked up by the more powerful governments and held under international law. I think that incongruity is not going to play well in the long run for people defending international law.
Do you have any like major concerns when it comes to what are your biggest criticisms, I guess, of the media coverage? Because you are a critical media literacy scholar.
Um, well, I have a couple. So one, I mean, I don't know if this is me just being petty, but like the New York Times ran this like article with like four authors talking about how like Trump was motivated to remove Maduro because he didn't like some of the dance moves Maduro was doing. And they opened up the article with something like one dance move too many. And I just thought, you guys are journalists. This is a complex issue. There's geopolitical implications. And
And we're doing this glib sort of
yeah, like,
funny honey funny ha ha ha, you know.
yeah. And it's like, if you want to be respected and taken seriously, act like a serious person. So I kind of frustrated with that with the New York Times. I was also frustrated to hear that reportedly the New York Times and Washington Post had information about this invasion before it happened and decided not to publish it publicly. Usually the justification for that is, well, we don't want to interrupt a U.S. mission, but your job as the press is not to help the powerful conceal information. Your role is to give the people the information so powerful cannot act in darkness or concealment. And I think they failed in that. I wonder what the response would have been if this had been leaking out prior to the invasion from U.S. citizens here at home. Maybe even some Congress people and the MAGA coalition would stand up and ask that America First question. So I thought that was something that bothered me. And then lastly, this always happens, these invasions. Whether or not you like Maduro or think he's a great guy is immaterial to the legality of what happened. So all these pieces on how bad Maduro is and how much Venezuelans are celebrating and how the Washington Post thinks this is justice. I think all of those things are largely, distractions from some of the more pivotal questions at hand. Now, having said that, I do think on the Sunday morning shows, particularly some folks like Margaret Brennan and even like I mentioned, Dana Bash, they did ask a couple tough questions of folks like Marco Rubio. And I think that's a good sign. So I do see some of that good journalism out there, but like the lack of historical context, the kind of glib reporting, the apologizing for power and furthering like the justification propagandistic narratives is really frustrating to
Well,
watch.
yeah, the thing that gets me is the just the repeating of well, Maduro is a brutal dictator, but and it's like this is the same thing with the Iraq War. You couldn't just say I'm opposed to this military intervention. This is adventurism. You had to always state that you didn't like Saddam Hussein as if it like it has it's irrelevant to it. You know what I mean? Like it's ah
Ye- Yeah, and I think the propagandists force you to add those qualifiers because if you just said I'm against this adventure in Iraq, immediately you'd be attacked with, well, what are you, a Hussein apologist? So people try and put that qualifier in there to like anticipate it, even though it's totally like an absurd non sequitur for the argument.
anything else you want to say in closing? And we'll have to do like a longer show just on critical media literacy, maybe the state of the media in
Oh, there we go.
2025. But what do you think we need to be keeping an eye on right now? Because I mean it's hard to do an episode like this in a way because I mean this Venezuela story is in motion as we speak. And it's like we're not going to know everything until, who knows when.
I agree. And I think historical context is really important here. Maduro and these U.S. relations didn't pop out of nowhere. So some of the stuff we talked about here, like the history of oil, is very important. The history of the regime change in that country is really important. But also, there's been a lot of talk I noticed about like the Monroe Doctrine, and I've just seen a lot of historical illiteracy about it. Some people thought it was a part of the Constitution, which it's not. I've heard other people say it's like a 19th century doctrine. It's like that's true, but presidents have subsequently used it, like most famously, like Teddy Roosevelt, or
Right. Well, in a
maybe,
way, I think more people should reference the Roosevelt
yeah, corollary, yeah.
corollary even than the Monroe Doctrine itself, if that makes sense.
I agree. And like General Smedley Butler wrote about in the 1930s about how it was the Monroe Doctrine and Roosevelt corollary that allowed him to operate under the U.S. military on all these continents. So it's not something Trump just kind of stumbled upon from the 19th century. These wheels have been in motion a long time, and I think a lot of times we treat Trump like an outlier, and I think it does us a disservice because he's really part of a longer process.
Trump himself is reference to Monroe Doctrine. I think he with the whole Don Roe document thing. It's such a goofy character. We don't take it. We don't take things seriously enough.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Well, hey, Nolan, I want to thank you again for coming on Parallax Views. I know this was a shorter episode for my listeners than usual, but there's been so much going on today, and I've done so many interviews. And I think this was one of the it's a very informative one because you just sort of lay out the facts. Is there anything I missed that you wanted to add, though? And
no,
also, of course, plug your stuff. You know?
Oh yeah, no, I think at this time we've gone through it, and of course I'll come back and talk with you anytime. You do a great show, and I hope your listeners continue to listen and support you. And they can support me. I'm at nolanhigdon.substack.com. That's where you can get the Gaslight Gazette, or you can listen to my podcast, The Disinfo Detox, where we do episodes, kind of what we did here, peeling back the curtain, what's true, what's false on some of these stories. And I just want to thank you again, man, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and the work you do is great.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/parallaxviews, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.